The following program is presented by the Far East Broadcasting Company because stories of people living out the gospel with their lives inspire all of us. FEBC, taking Christ to the world through radio and new media. Learn more at febc.org.
I mean, not all these people were heroes by any means. In fact, what makes those who were the heroes so heroic is in contrast to the rest. One of Washington's greatest of all strengths, and he had many strengths, was that he would not give up.
America will soon celebrate its 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And coming up now on First Person, we're going to reach into the archive for an interview from 2005 with historian David McCullough, who had just released his book, 1776. This Pulitzer Prize-winning author died in 2022, but it will be good to hear his familiar voice again as he talks about George Washington and the most important year of 1776. I'm Wayne Shepherd. Thanks for joining us. This will be a two-part interview with part two heard next week on the 4th of July here in 2026. But now let's begin with part one of 1776, a conversation with the late David McCullough about General George Washington and the fight for independence.
I was struck as I read of the extreme adversity that Washington led his army through, this rabble in arms, as they were called. It's just the whole book is about adversity and perseverance.
Thank you. That's exactly right. And it's why I wanted to write the book. When I was writing my biography of John Adams, I had to stay with my subject. I had to be where he was.
He wrote the story of his life.
You can't stray off on tangents. And he was in Philadelphia. He was taking part in the drama of the 1776 that was later turned into a Broadway show in which he was the central figure. And it's what we celebrate every year at July 4th.
But while that was going
on, an enormous amount was happening elsewhere, not very far away, in New York. By our standards, it was just down the road, that had everything to do with who we are, what we are able to call the blessings of a free American life. And if those people that you say so aptly suffered through hell hadn't done what they did, the Declaration of Independence would have been nothing but that, a declaration, words on paper. And we don't know sufficiently. When I was doing the Adams book, I came across a sentence in a letter that Abigail Adams wrote to her husband when he was in Philadelphia.
She wrote many of those letters.
She was back in Massachusetts. Yes, there are over 1,000 letters between John and Abigail Adams. She said, "Posterity who are to reap the blessings will scarcely be able to conceive the hardships and sufferings of their ancestors." And that's absolutely right. But she also said, "Great necessities call out great virtues." And I don't know of a better example of that. After September 11th, we heard a lot of people saying this is the darkest, most dangerous time we've ever been through. Well, anybody that said that didn't have much of a sense of history. I think September 11th was the worst day in the history of the United States. But we've been through darker times. And I think the darkest of them all, Wayne, was 1776, particularly the last half, when everything looked as though it were going against us and that the war was over and we'd lost.
We have so much to learn about what took place there and how tenuous the whole thing was. We tend to look at it now like, the Declaration of Independence and the Revolutionary War, everything was just fine.
I can't believe we won.
You said it's a little short of a miracle.
Thinnest of lines, again and again. There are several places where if it hadn't snowed, or if the wind had been in a different direction, that would have been it. The British would have won. And they would refer to this always, again and again, as the hand of God, the finger of God, providential fog. One of my favorite lines of all, which is a line from the play Cato, which they all knew.
Especially George Washington.
Yes, yeah. He said, the line is, "We can't guarantee success, but we can do better. We can deserve it." Which is to say, the outcome is in the hands of God or chance or however one wants to put it. But we can't control that, but we can control how we behave. which is a wonderful, wonderful point of view.
Yeah.
All we say now is being number one, getting to the top.
Yeah.
That's all that matters.
Yeah.
And who cares how you do it? Well, how many elbows you use or who you betray or the rest. Whom you betray, excuse me. And
there's the English literature major coming through.
But these people were very strong people. And life was harder then, even in peacetime.
Well, you describe those, quote, supernatural events, weather events even, that helped. And I have to tell you, I was moved to tears when I read of the Battle of Brooklyn and the retreat. Now, here we are, the American Army is in full-fledged retreat, and they are hemmed in Brooklyn, as you said in the book. I mean, they're doomed. And then suddenly this fog settles in, and that made a way for their escape.
Well, I would have gladly written a whole book in order to have written that story, that event. It's my favorite place in the whole book, and I think it's symbolically the most representative. Because it would seem that it was all pure luck that providential fog comes in.
Right.
And it's the Dunkirk of the Revolutionary War. Mm-hmm. And they escape. They live to fight another day.
And you're outnumbered by the British?
Oh, absolutely.
They've got you which way?
You've just lost a huge battle. It was the Battle of Brooklyn, which isn't the Gettysburg National Park now. You can't, it's all Brooklyn. But there was an enormous battle fought in Brooklyn. 40,000 people were involved over 6 miles. Biggest battle ever fought on the North American continent until then. And we were outfoxed, we were outflanked, we were outfought. Everything went right for the British. Everything went wrong for us. But after the battle was over, we were essentially trapped because the British fleet was in New York Harbor, and all they had to do was bring those 2 or 3 of those big warships up into the East River, and there would have been no way for the American Army in Washington to escape. Washington and his generals decided that they would attempt an escape the night of August 29th across the East River, go back across the river at night. Well, the wind that was howling out of the northeast, it was a nor'easter, and it was keeping the British fleet out of the East River, was also making the river so rough that these small boats that they'd assembled, this makeshift armada, couldn't negotiate the river.
Well, look at the river today.
So that's right, absolutely. And all of a sudden, it was like the Red Sea parting. All of a sudden, there came a dead calm. So the river got about as flat as it can get, and they knew they could do it. So they started across, back and forth, taking these soldiers and all their equipment, horses, cannon, everything.
No small task.
The water, 3 inches below the gunnels of these little sailboats. And by about 4 in the morning or shortly before dawn, it was clear they weren't going to get everybody off. Well, if daylight came and the British then saw what was up, the whole scheme was revealed, those troops remaining on the shore would have been annihilated. Mm-hmm. But just as this awful impasse was about to occur, a providential fog set in, dense fog. Men couldn't even see 3 feet in front of them. And that covered the retreat as well or better than the night had until everybody was off.
But only on that side of the river.
Yes. Meanwhile, over on the New York side, there was no fog at all. And so for anybody to feel, as they all did afterward, that something really powerful was at work here beyond what they could do was perfectly understandable. You still feel it when you read about it. 9,000 men were taken across that river at night by an amateur army. Now, an organized retreat is the hardest military movement to carry off effectively, even for trained soldiers.
Let alone under secrecy.
And when you're going, there are no running lights on those boats. But it isn't just the current and the fog and the night that makes it possible. That needs to be stressed. It's John Glover from Marblehead, Massachusetts, Colonel John Glover, and his Marblehead Mariners, they were all seamen and sailors. They pulled it off. And it would be hard to find a situation where more depended on a few men, and those men rose to the occasion to perfection, as happened that night. And I think if Washington had been trapped over there with his army, that would have been it. The war would have been over. I don't think there's much question about it.
And many attribute it to the hand of God. You see this in the letters and journals and
yes,
so on.
And everything that's happening happened in Philadelphia all depends on this. So we can talk about life, liberty, and this pursuit of happiness, and all men are created equal, the noblest of sentiments and ideals that were set forth, and let's hope will stand down another several hundred years or more. All of that would simply have been verbiage.
Historian David McCullough, and we will continue this conversation in a moment here on First Person.
Hi, I'm Ed Cannon, the president of the Far East Broadcasting Company, and I'd like to invite you to join us on our podcast, Until All Have Heard, where Wayne Shepherd and I will take you on a virtual tour around Christian ministry in the most unreached places in the world to see what God is doing through the ministry of the Far East Broadcasting Company.
So listen to the new weekly podcast, Until All Have Heard, from FEBC. Listen at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other podcast platforms, or go to febc.org. Let's continue now with David McCullough.
We were talking about the, quote, the hand of God, as many saw it in the battle for Brooklyn. Took place on the soil there in New York during the Revolutionary War. I'm just curious, I'm conscious of the fact that the Revolutionary War was preceded by what we call the Religious Great Awakening, and I'm just wondering if that sort of still reverberated those years later, if you saw any evidence of that.
Oh, very much. It's newspapers were not like we're accustomed to. There were no correspondents covering the Revolutionary War. You can't turn to the newspapers of that day and find out what exactly happened or why it happened. What you get are letters that they will publish, often quite well after the fact. The Battle of Brooklyn and the escape were both taken up in the newspapers, in letters to the editor, and you find it in private correspondence as both an example of the hand of God being against us and the hand of God being for us. Now, the escape was seen as providential chance to keep it going, you're pardoned now, you're going to be able to keep going. Yeah. But the defeat at Brooklyn was seen as very clear indication that God was punishing us for our sins. I'll read you just one example that came from the New England Chronicle. In the Chronicle, it says, Providence favored us in the escape. Then the Massachusetts Spy, which was a very popular newspaper, assured readers that the defeat on Long Island and consequent distress were loud speaking testimonies of the displeasure and anger of Almighty God against a sinful people. We thought God was for us and had given many and signal instances of his power and mercy in our favor, and had greatly frowned upon and disappointed our enemies. That was the victory in Boston they were referring to when we drove the British out. And verily it has been so. But have we repented and given him glory? Verily no. His hand seems to be turned and stretched out against us, and strong is his hand. Whether you're saying that God's hand is for us or God's hand is against us, God is involved in the eyes of all of these writers.
And we'd never hear that today. To me, that reflects a humble and contrite person to recognize that a sovereign God is in control of these things. Today, we would blame it on any one of a number of things.
Well, Abigail Adams, whose despair and shame she felt over slavery, that such a thing could exist in this country where we're calling for all men are created equal, wrote that when the war was going badly, and also all through this time there were terrible plagues of smallpox, epidemic dysentery, people dying in little towns all across New England, including hers, Braintree. And she said, I can't help but think that this is God's punishment for the sin of slavery. And she and her husband were not just against slavery. He was the only one, John Adams was the only one of the founding fathers who never owned a slave, as a matter of principle, not because he couldn't afford any such thing. We see this 18th century as sort of a cast of characters in a costume pageant, in their elegant but quaint clothing, the satin jackets for men and the breeches and the buckled shoes and the powdered hair. But this was it, and the elegance of the thinking, the Enlightenment, all of which was very real. But it was also a time of tremendous turmoil and violence and upheaval and stress, not unlike our own. And it wasn't as though everybody was for the revolution. They weren't.
Yeah, I was just thinking that because as I read your book, it came to me how, again, what a dangerous situation they were in, because here was an army fighting against the British. You couldn't count on all the citizenry being in your favor. I mean, there were loyalists
Absolutely
among
not.
you didn't know who was who sometimes, I would imagine.
Well, when the Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in Independence Hall that summer, that blistering hot summer, they kept all the windows closed. Not just the doors, the windows closed,
spies.
because they were afraid of how the word would get out.
Okay.
Because if you signed your name to a document, or if you wrote in a letter, as Nathanael Greene did, that we should have a Declaration of Independence, that was proof on paper that you were a traitor, and you could be hanged if you were caught. In New York and in New Jersey, on Long Island, on Staten Island, Loyalists, as we call them, or Tories, as they said, were in the majority. When the British troops landed on Staten Island for the first time in the summer of 1776, they were welcomed with open arms. They were the heroes. They were coming. And the Loyalists saw themselves as the true patriots. They were loyal to their king. They were loyal English subjects. And what many people don't understand today, and it's not puzzling, but we had the highest standard of living of any people in the world. Nobody lived better than we Americans. Now, by our standards, they didn't live very high on the hog.
Right.
But by the standards of the day, so when these British soldiers and the Hessians that came with them, the mercenary soldiers from Germany came with them, landed, and particularly when they went across to Long Island and saw all these beautiful farms and fat cows, cattle and sheep and orchards and mirrors and glass in the windows and all. They couldn't believe that any people lived so well. And how could they revolt against their king who was put where he was by God? They not only looked upon the rebels, what we call the Patriots, with contempt, they came to hatred.
Well, then that leads me about this army. Hastily, as I said earlier, just hastily assembled. I can't imagine where they came from and what motivated them to be a part of the whole thing.
Well, they came off the farm, Wayne, most all of them, and they looked like farmers in from the fields. Don't picture an army in uniform all
marching in tight formation.
Yeah. Somebody said they were the finest army that ever marched out of step. They had no uniforms, and after they'd been on the job for a while, they began to look pretty bad, dirty, unshaven, and unruly. Washington could not believe them when he first took command. They'd brought in this Virginian, this elegant Virginian, to be in command of what was essentially a New England army. That's all there were, was New Englanders.
And his attitude towards New England?
He thought they were the worst people he'd ever met. And on top of the fact that they looked dirty and seemed quite unruly, they had this odd idea that they could decide things for themselves. They'd vote on what they would do next. Now imagine trying to command an army that's each unit's going to vote to decide whether they'll go along. And they wouldn't serve unless they elected their own officers. This was a people that accustomed to town meeting and what we would call real democracy.
Yeah. Sort of a militia then.
Oh, that's what they were. And the officers were often elected, probably more often than not, elected because they were easy on them.
Ah, okay.
They didn't make them march in step. They didn't make them go through a lot of military rigmarole.
Popularity vote.
If you want to go off and do a little clam digging this afternoon, fine, Wayne, go ahead. Try to get back before sundown. And if a flock of geese flew over, they'd take their muskets and fire away so that they could have a better dinner that night. It was
well, how do you bring order to all that?
Slowly and with a great deal of frustration and inner anger. But yet, for all of this bias that Washington had against the New Englanders, he could overcome that and see in certain people great ability. He had an amazing capacity to spot talent when he saw it. And there were two men in particular, Nathanael Greene and Henry Knox. And those two men neither of whom had any experience in the military at this point.
Very young.
Very young. Greene was 33 when he was 33 and made a general, and all he knew about the military is what he'd read in books. And Knox was a big, garrulous Boston bookseller who was all of 25, and he knew nothing of the military except what he'd read in books. But it was a day and age when people believed that reading books was not a bad way to find out how to do things, how to learn. And Washington saw that these two had it. They had what it takes. And he not only gave them responsibilities far beyond their experience or age, but they were to be the only two with Washington. There would be 3 general officers who would serve through the entire war.
Which lasted until 1783?
1783. It was a grim, dirty, often bloody war.
So those 3
Yes.
served alongside Washington the whole time. There's another man named Joseph Reed that plays prominently in the book. I mean, the book is about the course of the year, but of course George Washington is the central figure here, as the commander, the general of the Army.
Yes.
But Joseph Reed comes along, a trusted confidant of Washington's.
He was a bright, engaging, he could see to the heart of a problem very quickly. I think that was his great gift. And he was a very gifted writer. And Washington really liked him. In fact, Washington, I think it'd be fair to say, loved him. He was Washington's most trusted confidant, and he betrays Washington.
Yeah.
It's Shakespearean. It's biblical. He thinks he's doing the right thing. Reed does. And it was either the most unfortunate, outrageous indiscretion on his part, or it was rank betrayal.
Was it momentary, or was it long-lasting?
No, it was momentary in the sense that it lasted over several months.
Right.
But it wasn't something he just happened to do in the spur of the moment.
Okay.
Washington was making serious mistakes. He was not himself.
And had his critics.
Oh, absolutely, as he should have. I mean, the fiasco at the Battle of Brooklyn was largely his fault. And then he made terrible misjudgment. Well, he really was not so much misjudgment as indecision at Fort Washington, where he let Greene decide that we would try to hold Fort Washington when we really didn't need to do so anymore. And the British just took it right away.
Another defeat,
A terrible defeat, and over 3,000 troops captured.
And all
their equipment, and we need every single soldier we can get, because by that time our soldiers are going home. They're just walking off and going home because their enlistments are up, or they're just going home because they're sick of it. They desert, or they go over to the enemy by the hundreds, by the thousands.
Oh.
I mean, not all these people were heroes by any means. And in fact, what makes those who were the heroes so heroic is in contrast to the rest who didn't stay the course. One of Washington's greatest of all strengths, and he had many strengths, was that he would not give up.
Well, that's just part 1 of our 2-part conversation with the late David McCullough, talking about George Washington and the momentous year of 1776. Next week on the 4th of July, you'll hear part 2, when we'll talk about the betrayal of General Washington by Joseph Reed. Our interview this week is a little different from what we normally do, but as we are about to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, I thought you'd enjoy hearing from such a distinguished historian. Listen again at firstpersoninterview.com. And a word of thanks to the Far East Broadcasting Company for making First Person possible. Learn more about this gospel-centered ministry at febc.org. Now, with thanks to my friend and producer Joe Carlson, I'm Wayne Shepherd. Join us for part 2 with David McCullough next week here on First Person.